In just a few days in February 2022, the post-Cold War order that had shaped Europe for more than 30 years was shattered. Russia launched the largest land invasion in Europe since World War II. Thousands of missiles, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, a country of 44 million people waking up to the sound of bombs. Most of the world was shocked. But the people who study these things were not shocked at all. For decades, analysts, diplomats, and former intelligence chiefs had been warning, in writing, on record, that this moment was coming.
So why did it happen? Why did one of the world's largest military powers send its army into a neighboring country in the 21st century? The answer depends on who you ask. Historians and policymakers continue to debate how much each factor influenced the Kremlin's decision. But both sides of that debate contain real evidence. This is the real story, and why the consequences are still reshaping the world right now.
In Kyiv, on the morning of February 24th, 2022, a family woke at 5 a.m. to a sound they had never heard before. Not thunder. Not construction, something deeper, something that shook the windows. The father checked his phone. The mother grabbed the children. They had 12 minutes to reach the basement. Across Ukraine that morning, millions of families did the same thing. This is the story of how the world arrived at that morning and why it matters far beyond Ukraine's borders. Before anything else, why Ukraine? Ukraine is Europe's second largest country by area. It has some of the most fertile farmland on Earth. It controls major Black Sea ports that connect landlocked regions to global trade routes. It sits directly between Russia and several NATO member states. For centuries, Ukraine was the breadbasket of empires. Whoever controlled it controlled the agricultural and strategic heart of Eastern Europe. Russia and Ukraine also share deep historical and cultural ties that Russian leaders have long used to argue that the two countries are fundamentally one people. Ukraine's own history tells a more complicated story. Centuries of distinct identity, language, and resistance to outside domination. That tension between Russia's vision of what Ukraine is and Ukraine's own sense of itself sits at the center of everything that follows. To understand 2022, you have to go back to 1991. For most of the 20th century, Russia sat at the center of the most powerful empire on Earth, the Soviet Union. 15 republics, 300 million people, nuclear weapons, a military that stretched from the Pacific to the heart of Europe. Then, in December 1991, it collapsed. Not through war, but from within. Overnight, Russia went from superpower to struggling nation. The economy collapsed. The ruble became nearly worthless. Millions fell into poverty. And 15 countries became independent nations, including Ukraine. Vladimir Putin later called the Soviet collapse the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. That was not just a personal opinion. It became the defining lens through which the Kremlin viewed everything that followed, including what was happening on Russia's western border. When the Soviet Union collapsed, NATO had 16 members, all in Western Europe and North America. Over the next 3 decades, 12 new countries joined. On a map, Russia watched NATO move from hundreds of miles away to directly along parts of its border, including the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which had once been Soviet republics. Russia objected, loudly, repeatedly. In 2008, at a NATO summit in Bucharest, the alliance declared that Ukraine and Georgia would eventually become members. No timeline, no formal process, but the door was officially open. That same year,
Bill Burns, then America's ambassador to Moscow, later CIA director, sent a now declassified memo to the Secretary of State. His warning was direct and specific. Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of all red lines for the Russian leadership. It will not be seen as an American victory. It will be seen as an existential threat. He was not writing opinion. He was reporting what Russian officials had told him directly. But here is the other side, and it carries equal weight. NATO is a defensive alliance. Every country that joined did so voluntarily because they feared Russia. Poland, the Baltics, and others had lived under Soviet domination. Under international law, sovereign nations have the right to choose their own alliances.
And when Putin made his speech justifying the invasion on February 21st, 2022, he barely mentioned NATO. Instead, he spoke of Ukraine as an artificial state, denied its legitimacy as a separate nation, and described it as historically part of Russia. Those are not the words of a leader acting in self-defense. They are the words of a leader with imperial ambitions. Historians and policymakers continue to debate how much each of these factors, NATO expansion, imperial ideology, domestic politics, actually drove the decision. What is not debated is who made it.
Through the 1990s and 2000s, Ukraine was pulled in two directions. Its west leaned toward Europe, toward democracy, trade, and eventual EU membership. Its east leaned toward Russia, toward historical and economic ties that went back centuries. In 2010, Ukraine elected Viktor Yanukovych, a politician friendly to Moscow. Then, in November 2013, Yanukovych walked away from a major EU trade agreement at the last moment, under pressure from Moscow.
Ukrainians took to the streets, millions of them, for months. In February 2014, security forces opened fire on protesters. Over 100 people were killed in Kyiv's Independence Square, the Maidan. Yanukovych fled. Ukraine's parliament voted to remove him. An interim pro-Western government took office before new elections were held. Moscow called it a Western-backed coup. Kyiv called it the revolution of dignity. What happened next left no room for interpretation.
Within days, unmarked soldiers began appearing across Crimea. No insignia, no identification, armed and professional. They occupied airports, military bases, and government buildings. Russia denied they were Russian. Putin later admitted they were. Russia justified what followed by pointing to the presence of its Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol, the ethnic Russian majority in Crimea, and a referendum in which a reported majority voted to join Russia. Most countries rejected that referendum as neither free nor credible. The United Nations General Assembly condemned the annexation as a violation of international law. Russia kept Crimea regardless.
It was the first time a European state had seized the territory of another by military force since World War II. Simultaneously, Russian-backed separatists seized buildings in eastern Ukraine's Donbas region. A war began that would grind for 8 years across trenches and shell-cratered fields, claiming thousands of lives before most of the world was paying attention. Ceasefire agreements, the Minsk Accords, were signed, then violated. The front line barely moved. For 8 years, Ukraine and Russia were neither at war nor at peace. And then, on February 24th, 2022, the waiting ended.
Russia's initial plan appeared to assume a quick victory. Columns of tanks drove toward Kyiv. Forces landed near the capital's airport. Many Western intelligence agencies privately expected Ukraine's government to collapse within days. It didn't. Ukrainian forces held. President Zelensky refused to evacuate. When offered a way out of Kyiv by Western officials, his response was recorded and broadcast around the world. "I need ammunition, not a ride." The advance on Kyiv stalled, then retreated.
Russia regrouped and refocused on eastern and southern Ukraine. The war became something grinding and brutal. Artillery across vast front lines, drone warfare, missile strikes on power stations and hospitals, cities reduced to rubble.
By 2026, the war had lasted over 4 years. Independent estimates suggest hundreds of thousands of military casualties on both sides. Civilian casualties have also been severe. Millions of Ukrainians displaced, cities that had stood for centuries destroyed. No peace agreement, no clear end in sight. And in Kyiv, millions of families had long since stopped being surprised by the sound of air raid sirens.
This war did not stay in Ukraine. Energy. Russia was Europe's largest gas supplier. When the war began, energy prices spiked across the continent. Ordinary families paid more to heat their homes because of decisions made in Moscow and Kyiv. Food. Ukraine and Russia together export roughly a third of the world's wheat. When Black Sea shipping was disrupted, global food prices surged. Countries in North Africa and the Middle East faced hunger crises they had no part in causing.
NATO. Finland and Sweden, neutral for decades, joined NATO within 2 years of the invasion. The alliance Putin feared expanding grew larger than at any point in its history, directly because of his decision to invade. The global order. For the first time since World War II, a major nuclear power had invaded a recognized sovereign state in Europe. Every assumption about borders, security guarantees, and international law was suddenly open to question. The family in that Kyiv basement in February 2022 didn't start this war. They couldn't stop it. They could only wait. And so, in different ways, could the rest of the world.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine is many things simultaneously. A war about borders drawn after empires collapsed. A war about military alliances and who gets to choose them. A war about whether one country can decide that another has no right to exist. And a war about what the rules of the international order actually are and whether anyone still enforces them. What is not in dispute is the cost. Paid in Ukrainian cities reduced to rubble. Paid in soldiers on both sides sent to die for objectives that keep shifting. Paid in food prices and energy bills and refugee flows that touched every continent. Paid by a family in Kyiv who woke at 5 a.m. to a sound they had never heard before. Whether this war ends through negotiation, military victory, or a frozen conflict, one question remains. What kind of world will be left when it does?
History isn't just what happened. It's the choices that still shape our world. Subscribe to World Told for more hidden stories behind global events.